Hi, my name is Orlando Rivera. I'm a sports scientist with approximately 10 years in the field, and I am looking to explore using barbell velocity to objectively auto-regulate load prescription in powerlifters. Just a little background on the sport of powerlifting. Powerlifting is indeed a sport. It consists of three separate events: the barbell back squat, the barbell bench press, and the barbell deadlift. It is contested across the world in various different federations. One of the more well-known drug-free federations is the International Powerlifting Federation, or the IPF. The first official American event was contested in 1965, and that was put on by the AAU. Since 1965, various federations have sprang up, one of them being the USAPL. The USAPL put on their first Raw Nationals in 2008 with 89 competitors. As you can see in this graph, the popularity of powerlifting has increased dramatically. We've increased from 89 competitors at Raw Nationals to most recently 1,372 competitors in 2019. So the goal of the sport of powerlifting is to compete in your three separate events already mentioned: the back squat, the bench press, the deadlift. Within these events, participants are allowed to take up to 3 separate attempts at each lift. So 3 attempts on the back squat, 3 attempts on the bench press, 3 attempts on the deadlift, in that order. Your goal is to lift the most weight possible for each separate event. When you have the largest load achieved for each separate event, will give you a score for each event. And then once all 3 events are completed, we combine the score from each separate event to achieve what we would call a total. The largest total wins across various divisions. These are based on gender, age, and weight class. Both coaches, athletes, and sports scientists have really been looking for methodologies to increase your total or strength, which are sometimes used interchangeably, for decades. One practice we have found to successfully increase strength is through the use of a periodized training program. While many definitions exist, I like this definition here, which is the planned modulation of training variables such as load, sets, reps, rest, modality, frequency, and more in order to improve performance and prevent the onset of overtraining. Now, in addition to this definition, we found that the research largely supports the use of periodization. Swinton et al. In 2009 found that 96.4% of high-level powerlifters in Britain were using some form of periodization, and largely in agreement with him is Shaw et al. In 2020, which found that 88.9% of Norwegian powerlifters are also utilizing some form of periodization. In addition to this, the literature agrees with the use of periodized training programs over non-periodized training programs in order to maximize both strength and hypertrophy. Hypertrophy being the growth of muscle, which usually supports an increase in maximum strength. So as I've already stated, there's various variables that are manipulated within a periodized program. The one that this study aims to look at is the total load. So load is incredibly important when attempting to increase maximum strength. What we know is that an excessive training load can lead to injury and or overtraining. And conversely, a training load that is too low may lead to suboptimal adaptations, or simply put, you might just not get strong. You might not maximize your hypertrophic adaptations. So we want to make sure as a sports scientist or coach that our athletes are using an appropriate training load. So the question really becomes kind of how are we determining what is an appropriate training load? And at this moment in time, something called percentage-based training really is the gold standard, which kind of dictates training load. Percentage-based training has to be established through 1RM testing, and then once 1 repetition maximum is found, training loads are based on as a percentage of that tested 1 repetition maximum. This methodology, percentage-based training, has been largely supported in the literature to promote hormonal, neural, metabolic, and even cardiovascular adaptations. In the example to the top right, this is a table that's adapted from Poliquin in 1988. What you can see in the bolded row is exact training percentages that athletes are supposed to train at based on their 1 repetition maximum. So if you look in the first column in weeks 1 to 2, Poliquin recommends that athletes train somewhere between 70 and 75% of a 1RM for 10 to 12 repetitions and 3 sets. And then as the weeks progress, the load is manipulated in addition to the sets and repetitions. So this is just an example of one periodized plan where they use percentage-based training to manipulate the load. Furthermore, in 2008, just to show how prevalent percentage-based training is used, in 2008 the ACSM released a position statement, a position stand regarding strength, stating specifically that novices should usually train somewhere between 60 and 70% of their 1RM, and then advanced athletes should train usually between 80 and 100% of their 1RM. So while percentage-based training is the current gold standard, there are some inherent concerns with the methodology. The first really resides around 1 repetition test, 1 RM testing. Because we are assigning a percentage, we have to do maximal testing. One, this is it's maximal, so it can increase the chances of injury. But in addition, 1 RM testing is incredibly time consuming. While these are some concerns that are highlighted in the research, my focus for my project is really looking at the general accuracy of percentage-based training. And it really looks at it from both an intra-participant and an inter-participant / inter-exercise perspective. From an intra-participant perspective, if you look at something called adaptation variability, what we found is that person-to-person adaptations are going to be within one person, adaptations are going to be highly variable. How you progress from week 1 to week 2 on a program may differ dramatically than week 10 to 11 or 20 to 21. So this variability can make it difficult to prescribe load as a percentage when you may be making large adjustments in week 1 to week 2 and smaller adjustments or smaller adaptations in week 10 to week 11, for instance. Furthermore, there's some research which is going to illustrate some of the inter-participant and inter-exercise variability with percentage-based training. What we've found is that exercise to exercise, percentage-based training is not equal. In addition, from population to population, relative percentages are not always equal. And I'll talk about those a little bit later on. And just the most important bottom line of all of these concerns is that if the load is not accurate, it can lead to overtraining and or injury. So while percentage-based training is the current gold standard, it is not the only methodology. It goes beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss each and every one methodology. But what I am going to be looking at is another objective form of load prescription, which we would call velocity-based load prescription, and then a subjective form, which is repetitions in reserve based RPE, or based rate of perceived exertion. And we could start to look at how we got to the current dominant percentage-based training model. In 1945, Delorme really looked at the best methodology to restore power in 12 injured males. They were injured in the knee area. And the most important findings were, at the time, within the rehabilitation world, they were really looking at like muscular endurance and restoring muscular endurance. And he found that power and strength returned faster using heavy resistance with low repetitions. And this methodology was later coined the progressive resistance exercise, or PRE. And this has really been the foundation for all strength training research since then. In 1981 and 1988, Stone et al. And Poliquin started to release various periodized programs, and what Stone found was that linear periodized program was superior to non-periodized plans for building both strength and power. And then Poliquin's paper, as I already pointed out earlier, was one of the first papers that actually highlighted exact training percentages at exact training weeks for coaches and athletes to use. Interparticipant and exercise variability. I think these three studies really underpin some of the potential problems with percentage-based training. In 1987, Hojer et al. Looked at 38 untrained males and had them perform different exercises, and I specifically the leg press and the bench press, mostly because those are most relevant or closely related to powerlifting. So if you look at the major findings column, you'll see that at 60% on the leg press, participants were able to perform almost 34 repetitions. But at 60% on the bench press, participants were only able to perform 19.7 repetitions. And in agreement with this, at 80% on the leg press, participants were able to perform 15.2 repetitions, but on the bench press, only 9.8 repetitions on the bench press. And then in 2014, Reichens et al. Looked at two different populations. So they were comparing two populations, experienced weightlifters versus cross-country endurance athletes. And they also had the athletes perform repetitions until failure at various percentages of their 1RM. And if you look at what they did, was at 80% of their 1RM, the endurance athletes were able to perform almost 20 repetitions, while the weightlifters were only able to perform 11.8 repetitions. And then at 90% of their 1RM, the endurance athletes were able to perform 10.8 repetitions on average, while the weightlifters were only able to perform 7. So kind of once again, you can't just broadly prescribe training percentages. You have to now also look into the population. It really becomes population dependent. So those are two really important studies which highlight some potential problems. The last study here is a study by Hubble et al. In 2005, and here they had 585 participants, both male and female, perform the same exact training program for 12 weeks. And this study is particularly interesting because even though these participants performed the same exact training study, the results varied widely. And what you'll see is that on average, hypertrophy or muscle improved 18.9%. So on average, people's biceps, they trained the bicep, improved 18.9%. However, what you notice is that the range of outcomes was incredible, where one person actually lost muscle size after training for 12 weeks, and another person increased the size of their bicep brachii by 59%. So that's a dramatic difference in terms of the actual outcomes. And then taking it a step further, the difference in strength was even further. On average, participants increased the strength of their bicep 54%, but the range here was 250%. There was one person within the group who did not get stronger at all, and one person within the population improved 250%. And it really comes down to, well, if they performed the same program, why were their training outcomes so dramatically different? And it's possible that maybe some of these studies done above really can explain that. Maybe one person in the population was a little bit more of a endurance athlete. So now I'm going to jump into something called autoregulation. At this point, I haven't given definition, so autoregulation can be defined as modifying daily or weekly training parameters like load based on an athlete's current readiness. Autoregulation is really gaining steam in the research these days. However, it's important to note that autoregulation is not new. Knight in 1979 was the first to really explore autoregulation in the research, and he developed a methodology called the DAPRI, or Daily Adjustable Progressive Resistance Exercise. And he really had an interesting quote at the end of his paper, where he said they all suffer from a common weakness, and he's talking about the other loading methodologies. Right? You can kind of substitute in that sentence is, I would say, working at his or her appropriate level or optimal level. And that's what really, that's what some researchers believe that percentage-based training suffers from. But there's no way to determine if a load is appropriate with percentage-based training. So DAPRI was later on adapted from a strength coach named Mel Sif, and then was later subsequently empirically tested by Mann et al. In 2010, where he looked at 23 Division I football players, which auto-regulated load and compared it to a percentage-based training, and he squat, the bench, and even sub-maximal strength on the bench press. In 2018, Helms et al. Looked at RPE, or rate of perceived exertion loading, versus percentage-based training loading, and while he did not find significant differences, he did find small effect sizes favoring the RPE loading methodology. On the last slide, I talked a little bit about auto-regulation and some other loading methodologies other than percentage-based training. So now here I'm talking a little bit about velocity-based training, which can be auto-regulated. One of the first studies, and this is an important study, was done by Gonzalez, Badillo, and Sanchez Medina. And what they found was that there was a nearly perfect inverse correlation between velocity and percentage. So essentially what that means is, as the relative percentage of weight went up, so as somebody went from 60% to 70% of their 1RM and 70% to 80% of their 1RM, the velocity decreased. And that makes sense. As the weight gets heavier, they're going to move the weight a little bit lighter. So once we were able to find that there is a strong inverse correlation between load and velocity, we can now really start to look at velocity as a proxy for load. Maybe we don't need percentage-based training. Maybe we can move into velocity, and that's what Orange and Durrell started to look at. These were two of the first studies that actually used velocity-based autoregulation in longitudinal models, and they had some interesting findings. In 2019, Orange looked at 27 rugby players in season, and while they did not find improvements in strength, they did find that the time under tension and perceived stress was lower with velocity-based training when compared to percentage-based training. And I think the perceived stress is incredibly important as these athletes are in season. They want to make sure, you want to feel like you're not doing too much while in season. Durrell looked at 16 resistance trained males, and he found that improvements on different lifts like the bench press, deadlift, and overhead press were either the same or even better with less total training volume. So they lifted like less total volume, less total tonnage, and they found equal improvements or better improvements. There were significant differences in the bench press and counter movement jump. And if you can lower your training volume while having similar improvements, once again, that's probably a more effective strategy. Moving on to a little bit of theory. Before I even go into general systems theory, I think this picture aptly kind of generalizes my view of where the training world has gone. And the expression is, you can't see the forest through the trees. And in my opinion, sports science has become so enamored, so obsessive about finding these little details, the exact sets, the exact repetitions that optimize performance or that reduce injury. But we have to remember that the end goal is performance, or the end goal might be reduction in injury, and that these are complex systems, right? You can't just look at one variable without forgetting about the entire system. And that's where general systems theory really comes into play. General systems theory was first put together by Ludwig von Bertalanffy in 1972. And there's four main principles that can be related to sports science or training to some extent. And these principles are nonlinear effects, circular causality, multifinality, and equifinality. What nonlinear effect states is that a change in variable x can lead to either a proportional or non-proportional change in variable y. Circular causality really looks at what causes things to happen. Things can change from a top-down approach or from a bottoms-up approach. Multifinality states that the same road can lead to multiple paths of how we can apply these in a sports science context for each of them. Nonlinear effects of injury. In 2019, Paul et al. Wrote a nice paper explaining what causes injuries. And it can change why in many different ways. And that really sums up nonlinear effects. Epigenetics have been written about many times in recent years, where our expression of genes, we're born with a certain set of genes, but how they are expressed is very different. They can be from a top-down approach, brain down, or from a muscular approach, in that our circumstances are going to affect how they're expressed. So something like your activity level, your nutritional status, is going to alter actual gene expression, and that's circular causality. Multifinality really goes back to that Hubble paper that I talked about in the literature review portion, where if you think about it, those 585 participants all followed the same exact training program, but had this wide range of outcomes, from 0 to 250% in strength, right? And then finally, equifinality, what you really could look at is just the various methodologies. So you could look at something like periodization. You could look at linear periodization versus non-periodized programs. Both tend to improve strength. So you have two different roads that still improve strength. You could look at loading programs. You could look at rate of perceived exertion loading versus percentage-based training loading, and both do improve strength, right? So you have these different roads that lead to that single outcome of improved strength or hypertrophy. So I have a few conceptual models that kind of display general systems theory. The first is from more of a health perspective. This was put forth by George Engel in 1977. At the time, the dominant model of health was really the biomedical model. And he argued that the biomedical model approach was a little too reductionist in nature, where he felt that other practitioners could really boil every single disturbance from homeostasis down to the molecule and explain it because of that. And he argued that it didn't really take into account the psychological or social elements of health. And a quote from his paper is that health and sickness are diffused by cultural, social, and psychological considerations. So one example that he put forth was grief. Grief, you could go to a doctor, you could say my heart hurts, something along those lines, maybe somebody had passed away, and at times a doctor might see you and say you're perfectly fine, but again, the grief really, or the biopsychosocial model of health starts to take into consideration those psychological and those social elements, and is more from a complex system approach versus a reductionist approach. Another example, and there's really two on this page, are the Hans-Selye's general adaptation syndrome and the theory of supercompensation. The picture here is an example of supercompensation. When somebody goes into a training session, you've got a given level of fitness. As you go through that training session, your fitness or readiness to perform is actually decreased, whether it's substrate reduction, muscular damage, whatever it is, you are less fit after that training session. But through recovery, you're going to enhance and super compensate. And I should have used the word, instead of training session, you go through some stressors. And that's what a training session really is. You are exposed to various stressors like weights, if you're running, a cardiovascular stressor. Okay, and what really happens is you adapt and come back better. Hans-Selye took it a step further, and he really exemplifies general systems theory in that he says everything is a stressor. Heat, cold, life stress is a strong example of a stressor and can have a negative or positive impact on performance. So what really happens is, once again, if we think about training, maybe, right, you are supposed to train at a certain percentage on a certain day, but you might not be ready to handle the stress from the gym because outside stressors have now become too great, whether it's grief, whether it's too hot outside. So you need to adjust your current training load because your outside stressors are too high, and percentage-based training will not allow you to do that, at least not auto-regulated training. Velocity may be one viable alternative for this. To kind of just put it together, really just summing everything up, this is just one graphic I put together where I feel, as I've stated, we've gone closer and closer to this reductionist model, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're attempting in sports science to figure out what works and what doesn't, where we've started with like general models of periodization from Galen and Medvedev in 1970s to different periodization models, linear, reverse linear, and now we're starting to look at, okay, what are the optimal sets? People ask me all the time in the gym, how many sets should I do? Or it just comes up in conversation. Now we're just trying to figure out, well, what's the optimal load? And the answer is, it really depends on so many variables, just like Hans-Selye's model outside of the gym. What did you do yesterday? How did you feel? How did you eat enough? Did you sleep enough? and we need to kind of widen our lens a little bit to figure out the optimal approach. So our knowns versus our unknowns. Uh, we know that periodized programs tend to produce superior gains in both strength and hypertrophy than non-periodized programs. Just the basic definition of periodization. Load prescription we know is important, especially for maximum strength and hypertrophy to a slightly lesser extent. Knowing that load prescription is important, there are various loading methodologies that exist. Like in this study, I'm looking at percentage-based training, RPE, and velocity-based training. At this time, percentage-based training is the gold standard, the conventional method. And what we've also found, which can be problematic, is that the adaptive process is highly variable. So what we don't know, well, do set timeframes exist for adaptation? Do you adapt exactly from week 1 to week 2 in a training program as week 2 to week 4 or 3 to 5, whatever it is? Are we over or under prescribing load based on 1 repetition maximums and using percentage-based training? And then finally, is there a best methodology to individualize training? For my research questions, research question 1, is velocity-based load prescription a viable alternative to a similar percentage-based training methodology in producing strength gains and subsequently in hypertrophic gains? I did this for both velocity-based load prescription with RPE as well. I'm also going to be looking at perceived stress and perceived recovery status with all 3 methodologies: percentage-based training, RPE, and velocity-based training. And then finally, for 9 and 10, is velocity-based load prescription a viable alternative to a conventional percentage-based training methodology in reducing that variability of adaptation? That goes back to that Hubble study. Can we reduce that 0 to 250% variable adaptation response? As far as my design, I'm going to be doing a quantitative research approach. It's going to involve a pretest followed by an 8-week longitudinal randomized control trial, and this will be followed up by a post-test. My participants will be powerlifters. Inclusion criteria are greater than 2 years resistance training experience and having competed within either the USAPL or USPA Federation within the last 5 years. So if somebody competed 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they will not be allowed to partake in this study. You have to be greater than 17 years of age and free from injury. Some exclusion criteria is a prior use of anabolic steroids, and you are not allowed to compete during the duration of this study. I plan on using some convenient purposive sampling, where I'll be going to some local gyms in the area, namely SMG Powerlifting, Mount Vernon Barbell, and Multisport Workshop. I'll speak with owners and post flyers at the gyms. In addition, I will be using some snowball sampling for any participants that can find family, friends, or through social media of anyone else that's interested in participating in this study. Here's my power analysis, where my primary dependent measures are strength and hypertrophy. Like I said, my primary variables are strength and hypertrophy. My other dependent variables that I'm looking at are perceived stress, perceived recovery status, and that variability out of adaptation. And my groups are going to be a percentage-based training group, or group that receives percentage-based training, a group that receives or goes through RPE-based training, and a group that goes through velocity-based training. Here's an example of a flowchart of the process of going through the experiment. This is a picture of Vitruvi linear encoder that I'll be using for my study. So essentially what happens is the encoder is placed on the ground, and then there's a string that is attached to the barbell, and then it measures the time and distance or the displacement, the amount of displacement, and that can give you the velocity at which the barbell moves. To the right of this is an example of an RPE chart that I'll be using for anyone that goes through the RPE-based loading protocol. This is an example of a linear periodized program using percentage-based training, and this was adapted from Helms et al. In 2017. Once again, it's an 8-week program that's periodized over the course of 8 weeks. To the right of that is also a table using RPE-based loading, and this was also adapted from Helms et al. In 2017. This chart here has been adapted from Helms et al. By myself, where they are doing the same, they're matched for sets and repetitions. So what does that mean? In week 1 on Monday, both groups are doing 2 sets, or all 3 groups are doing 2 sets of 8, but at this point they'll be using a velocity equivalent of 65%, not exactly 65%. So the weight can be greater, it can be lower, just whatever the velocity range is. So this provides a flexible loading structure, which is similar to RPE. The range is going to be determined as outlined by Banyard and utilized by Orange. So Orange, in his study with 27 rugby players, applied a range which is 0.06 meters per second above and below the target velocity. If they perform above the target velocity, you increase the load by 5%. If they perform below the target velocity, they decrease the load by 5%. Here's an example of the perceived recovery status scale. Participants will fill this out every day prior to training. And they will also fill the daily analysis of life demands for athletes out every day prior to training. I'll be doing a one-way analysis of variance, or an ANOVA, for my 3 independent variables, PBT, RPE, and VBT. I'm also looking to assess differences, weekly differences, in the amount of sets, repetitions, and loads, so the total training volume, the relative training volume, and the relative intensity per repetition. And just to wrap things up, as I've stated several times, we know periodization is largely supported in the literature, and we know loading is one very important variable or subcomponent of periodization. Percentage-based training is the current gold standard methodology to determine load. It is possible that percentage-based training may lead to an inaccurate loading strategy, and this is made evident through inter-participant variability, exercise variability, and inter-participant adaptation variability. At this point, it seems like velocity-based training may serve as a viable alternative for auto-regulating load prescription and possibly reducing the variability of the results, or maximizing strength and hypertrophy.